Was Protestantism founded by enemies? Protestants often claim that the birth of their denominations was the lifelong pursuit and immortal achievement of the Reformation leader, Martin Luther. However, regrettably, this does not align with the clear and irrefutable historical records. In fact, quite the opposite is true. Protestantism was entirely created by its own enemies. These so-called enemies include 1. Bafflingly, King Henry VIII of England, clearly anti-Protestant, yet he spearheaded the charge for Protestantism, engaging in widespread schism. 2. Quirky and unpredictable, Elector Frederick III of Saxony, as a devout Catholic, he paved the way and protected Protestantism through thick and thin. 3. Paradoxically, the leaders of the Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and others detested schism, yet they produced a large number of schismatic sects. Among these, perhaps the most formidable and bewildering figure is Henry VIII. His masterful ability to change his stance and his powerful influence could surely shock naive young women to the point of cold sweats and utter astonishment. King Henry VIII of England. Martin Luther published the 95 Theses in year 1517. The Act of Supremacy was concocted by King Henry VIII of England in year 1534. During this 17-year period, the Reformation movement remained a low-intensity civil rights movement. The reformers were also consistently naive in their aspirations for reform, while opposing the establishment of new denominations. This was because everyone knew that reform was defiance against the Holy See, establishing new denominations was defiance against the Bible. Therefore, when it came to splitting Christianity, it's likely that, even if some individuals harbored such intentions, they lacked the audacity, single-handedly, openly, and taking the lead in the earth-shattering act of splitting Christianity, was the fearless troublemaker, King Henry VIII of England. Ironically, he had always opposed Martin Luther. To this end, he had even gone to the trouble of writing books himself, earning him praise from the Pope. However, the situation took a sudden turn, and unexpectedly, Henry VIII, for the sake of his trivial, personal marital issues, turned against the Holy See, audaciously breaking away from the papacy, dissolving monasteries within his jurisdiction, and privatizing church lands and properties. Henry VIII's plunder of church property was carried out in stages. 1. Year 1534, he manipulated Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy, establishing himself as the supreme head of the Church of England. This laid the legal foundation for seizing church property. 2. Year 1536, he manipulated Parliament to pass the Act for the dissolution of the lesser monasteries, dissolving smaller monasteries, with an annual income below £200, marking the beginning of the seizure of church property. 3. Year 1539, he manipulated Parliament to pass the Act for the dissolution of the greater monasteries, further expanding the scope of the seizure of church property, dissolving all remaining larger monasteries. For year 1540 to 1541, the complete dissolution of monasteries and the confiscation of their property reached its peak. At this point, schism began. However, Henry VIII did not embrace Protestantism or secretly court it. Instead, he called his own denomination the Independent Church of England, which is the predecessor of the current Anglican Church. Although both names are used, Church of England is commonly used domestically, while Anglican Church is often used internationally. Initially, this denomination did not undergo significant changes in doctrine, sacraments, or administrative structure. However, Henry VIII's successors, his son and 2 daughters, except for Mary I, who briefly attempted to restore Catholicism, generally moved closer to Protestantism. Under Elizabeth I, the final decision was made, positioning the Church of England between Catholicism and Protestantism. Nevertheless, academia still prefers to categorize the Anglican Church as a Protestant denomination. Therefore, the top 3 Protestant sects, in order of when they formally became independent sects, are as follows. 1. Lutheranism. Year 1529, created by secular princes based on the ideas of Martin Luther. 2. Church of England Anglican Church. Year 1534, the result of King Henry VIII of England, playing with fire. 3. Calvinism Reformed tradition, year 1541, formulated by John Calvin himself. Please note that Martin Luther, King Henry VIII, and John Calvin all initially vehemently opposed schism. Even after breaking with Rome, Henry VIII largely adhered to fundamental Catholic doctrines and rituals. He did not accept some of Martin Luther's core tenets, such as justification by faith alone. While Henry VIII opposed the authority of the Pope, he also did not tolerate radical Protestant movements within his own country, executing some Protestant zealots. Continental European princes initially mocked Henry VIII's recklessness. However, seeing that the Holy See did not launch a crusade against him, they grew bolder, and later imitated Henry VIII, starting their own similar acts of defiance, eventually leading to widespread turmoil and wars. Henry VIII, in turn, began to mock his continental European counterparts for their amateurish attempts at playing with fire. At that time, several wars in Europe were almost entirely triggered by the Reformation. However, the nature of these wars quickly became secularized and politicized. What's even more bizarre is that infighting broke out among those within the same religious camp. A truly strange and perplexing situation. Why didn't the Holy See call for a crusade? Henry VIII openly annexed the assets of others. This blatant violation of the spirit of contract in the Western worldview was an outright act of national fascism. So, why didn't the Holy See call for a crusade against him? There will certainly be many grand diplomatic pronouncements and irrefutable political sophistries to answer this question, but these are all beside the point. The undeniable reason is that the Pope is an enlightened religious leader, not a fatuous secular king. If Pope Paul III at the time had possessed the same level of moral integrity as Henry VIII, he would have undoubtedly called for a crusade and sanctioned the assassination of Henry VIII. Pope Paul III's relationship with Henry VIII was a case of trying to reason with an unreasonable person. The Pope, after all, was a living saint, with the ultimate creed of, "I would rather the world betray me than I betray the world." Therefore, he followed the teachings of the Bible. If someone strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also. Indeed, Henry VIII struck the Pope's left cheek. Later, some continental European princes, emulating Henry VIII, struck the Pope's right cheek. Despite the slaps in the face, the Holy See, as a tangible entity, still needed to make some gesture, even if only symbolic. Excommunication was the most severe religious sanction of the Holy See. Pope Clement VII excommunicated Henry VIII in year 1533 and year 1535, finally reaffirmed by Paul III in year 1538. This meant that, under canon law, Henry VIII was expelled from the church. In life, he could not participate in any church sacraments. In death, he could not be buried in consecrated ground. At the time, this held significant symbolic importance. The Holy See recalled and refused to send envoys to the court of a king excommunicated by the Pope as a sign of condemnation for his actions. Henry VIII also expelled the Pope's representatives. The Holy See had the authority to declare a monarch deposed and release their subjects from their former oaths of allegiance. Although Pope Paul III did issue the bull of excommunication against Henry VIII, which contained similar implications, calling on the English subjects to revolt against Henry VIII was not a gentlemanly course of action. Placing an interdict was a sanction against an entire region, prohibiting the performance of any church services within that area, except for baptism and last rites. The Holy See could theoretically have placed England under interdict, but this would have severely harmed the religious lives of ordinary people, and would have exacerbated the conflict between the populace and the monarchy. Therefore, the Pope was hesitant to do so, and given that Henry VIII had already effectively taken control of the church within his realm, the actual effectiveness of an interdict would have been greatly diminished. Some argue that the Holy See's appeasement led to a missed opportunity as they watched the domino effect of schism become irreversible. In reality, the church had its own unspoken difficulties. After all, times had changed, and the church was no longer in its former glory. Of course, this also provided an opportunity for opportunistic elements among the continental European princes to rise up and seek personal gain. The opportunism of continental princes. Splitting religion and forming denominations is no easy task. It requires the backing of the state machinery. Therefore, it must have the protection of secular regimes. Relying solely on a scholar or a brilliant intellectual is unthinkable. Besides Elector Frederick III of Saxony, other important early secular supporters of the Reformation included Landgrave Philip I of Hesse. Some imperial free cities, such as Strasbourg, Nuremberg, and Augsburg. Later, more princes from northern and southern Germany joined in. It is worth noting that the secular princes who supported the Reformation did not necessarily all agree with Martin Luther's doctrines. Many were merely seeking to break free from the control of the Holy See and to seize the enormous wealth of the Church. These individuals were the opportunists. For example, Landgrave Philip I of Hesse was an important early supporter of the Reformation. He was very active politically and militarily. Although he openly sided with the Protestants, he was not personally devout in his religious beliefs. His subsequent bigamy incident speaks volumes, as adultery is a major sin in the Ten Commandments. This shows that his personal conduct was not entirely governed by religious principles. As the Reformation movement continued to ferment, some opportunistic princes in northern Germany saw an opportunity to break free from the control of the Holy See and enhance the power of their own territories. Thus, they did not necessarily agree with Luther's theological ideas, but rather viewed the Reformation as a political tool to achieve their own secular goals. Consequently, they stepped onto the stage and took a leading role. Some imperial free cities supported the Reformation partly to gain greater autonomy and break free from the control of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Catholic Church. Economic interests were also a significant consideration, as these cities often possessed considerable wealth. They hoped to reduce their tribute-like economic contributions to the Church. The most representative of these opportunists was Landgrave Philip I of Hesse. Landgrave Philip I of Hesse. Landgrave Philip I of Hesse 1504–1567 was a highly significant prince during the German Reformation and one of the early main supporters of the Protestant cause. His story is filled with political maneuvering, religious zeal, and some rather controversial ethical and religious transgressions. Philip I inherited the title of Landgrave of Hesse at a young age. Initially, he held a cautious attitude towards the Reformation movement. However, during the Diet of Worms in 1521, he met Martin Luther for the first time. This encounter had a profound impact on him. In 1524, after meeting another important reformer, Philip Melanchthon, Philip I resolved to formally convert to the Protestant Lutheran faith. After his conversion, Philip I became a staunch supporter of the Reformation movement. He actively promoted Protestantism within his territories and confiscated Catholic Church property. He firmly believed that Protestantism could bring about a purer faith and a more favorable social order. In this regard, Philip I also appears to be a naive and simplistic visionary, as later developments proved that Protestantism was not only impure, but also divided into numerous factions that contradicted and opposed each other with a level of animosity that even surpassed the divisions with Catholicism. Philip I not only supported Protestantism religiously, but also actively engaged politically and militarily to protect the interests of Protestant princes. Despite his support for the Reformation, Philip I, like Martin Luther, opposed radical social change. He participated in the suppression of the German Peasants' War and defeated Thomas Munzer's peasant army in the Battle of Frankenhausen in 1525. In fact, the leader of the peasant army, Thomas Munzer, was also a reformer, even more radical than Martin Luther. He linked the Reformation with social revolution, advocating for the establishment of an egalitarian society ruled by the elect of God. Munzer actively participated in and led the peasant uprising in the Thuringia region. His ideas had a significant influence on this peasant army. Ultimately, He was defeated and executed in the Battle of Frankenhausen. From this perspective, the suppression of the peasant uprising was an internal conflict within the Reformation movement, purely a misunderstanding. In 1531, Philip I, together with Elector Frederick I of Saxony, formed the Schmalkaldic League. This was a military and political alliance of Protestant princes aimed at resisting the pressure of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and safeguarding the freedom of Protestant faith and the autonomy of the princes. The most controversial event in Philip I's story was the permission he obtained for bigamy in 1540. He was already married to Christina of Saxony and had children. However, he requested to marry a noblewoman named Margarethe von der Saal. This was a highly controversial act in the Protestant ethics of the time. To this end, he sought the secret permission of Martin Luther and other Protestant leaders. Ultimately, with their tacit consent, the bigamous marriage took place. This event severely damaged his personal reputation and that of the Protestant cause, sparking widespread controversy within Protestant circles. After all, the famous biblical saying clearly defines this as a major sin of lewdness that offends divine law. Moreover, he dragged some religious leaders down with him. The conflict between the Schmalkaldic League and Emperor Charles V eventually escalated into the Schmalkaldic War of 1546 to 1547. Although Philip I personally led his troops, the Protestant League was defeated. Philip I was captured and imprisoned for several years. To regain his freedom, Philip I accepted the Emperor's Augsburg Interim, which aimed to restore Catholic unity. However, the people of Hesse resisted reconversion to Catholicism. Perhaps this was all an act. If public opinion were enough to sway politics, then politicians would certainly change their tune. However, this episode was likely a deceptive tactic orchestrated by Philip I to secure his release, rather than a genuine change in his religious beliefs. After his release, Philip I continued to rule Hesse in his later years, and to some extent regained his influence. After his death in 1567, his territories were divided among his four sons. Although Philip I played a significant role, it was far less fantastical and enigmatic than that of Elector Frederick III of Saxony. Elector Frederick III of Saxony. Elector Frederick III of Saxony, whose full name was Friedrich von Wetten, commonly known as Frederick the Wise, was a highly influential prince in the German territories during the Reformation. Born in 1463, he served as the Elector of Saxony from 1486 to 1525. An elector was a prince who held the privilege of electing the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1502, Frederick III founded the University of Wittenberg in his power center, the city of Wittenberg, and appointed Reformation leaders such as Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon to its faculty. Later, this university became a crucial base for the Reformation movement. In 1519, after the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, some princes nominated Frederick III as his successor. However, considering his own strength and the imperial situation, he politely declined this proposal, and instead supported Charles of the Habsburg family, who later became Charles V. In fact, the real reason lay in his previous support for the Reformation movement. The Holy See would not have supported his succession. After all, the difference between the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Empire lay in the word holy, meaning consecrated by the Roman Catholic Church. Frederick III is best known for his protection of Martin Luther. He advocated that every subject should receive a fair trial. After the Edict of Worms in 1521, declared Luther an outlaw of the empire, subject to being killed by anyone. Frederick III kidnapped Luther and secretly hid him in Wartburg Castle, shielding him from persecution. Without Frederick III's use of secular power for protection, Martin Luther's fate would certainly have been one of two. Like his predecessors, being burned at the stake by the Roman Catholic Church, being hunted down by bounty hunters, and dying a violent death. If Martin Luther had been killed, the history of the Reformation movement would likely have been rewritten. Frederick III was a man of great political acumen. He earned the epithet the Wise, due to his prudent political wisdom, his support for culture and education, and the wise stance he adopted in the complex religious and political struggles. Frederick III can be described as a principled and morally upright recluse in the secular world. He unequivocally supported reform, but clearly opposed schism. Therefore, he remained a devout Catholic throughout his life. This contrasts with some Reformation leaders who initially voiced thunderous and resounding opposition to schism but later, when the movement spiraled out of control and schism became a reality, embraced it. In reality, this does not change the historical record that they were once enemies of schism. Reformation leaders were all enemies of schism. Broadly speaking, the great intellectuals among the Reformation leaders were initially all enemies of schism. They spoke with certainty and vehemently opposed it. Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and others spearheaded the rebellion. However, their initial intentions were to advocate for change, opposing religious division. But when the situation later spiraled out of control and schism became a reality, they found themselves in a predicament with no way back. Since they were already caught in the current, they could only brace themselves and be pushed onto the altar by the popular movement of deification. Thought and action were the theoretical core of Protestantism's emergence. These three challenged some of the doctrines and rituals of the Roman Catholic Church at the time, triggering a widespread and chaotic mix of religious and social changes. After the ideas of these spiritual leaders spread, groups of believers who identified with their concepts began to appear in various regions. These groups, due to the different social, political, and cultural environments of their localities, as well as varying interpretations of the Reform ideas, gradually formed their own organizations. Many Protestant sects, in their later development, are indeed often associated with the Reformation leaders, such as Lutheranism and Calvinism. However, this is more of a historical tracing and a reflection of intellectual origins rather than these leaders directly founding them. After all, Martin Luther publicly emphasized his opposition to naming churches after himself. Over time, due to different understandings of doctrine, church governance, and the emergence of new religious movements within Protestantism, new sects and branches continued to arise. These new sects were often not directly founded by the original Reformation leaders. Among these, the earliest sect was Lutheranism, also known as the Evangelical Church. The birth of the Protestant denomination of Lutheranism. In 1530, at the Diet of Augsburg, convened by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the followers of Martin Luther, primarily princes and cities, in the German territories, submitted a confession of faith known as the Augsburg Confession. This confession systematically articulated the fundamental beliefs of Lutheranism, marking the formal emergence of Lutheranism as an independent denomination. Although this confession was signed by secular princes, its content and spirit were entirely derived from the ideas of Martin Luther. To safeguard their religious beliefs, the princes who supported Protestantism formed political and military alliances, such as the Schmalkaldic League. This league was established in 1531 in Schmalkalden, Thuringia, to resist the oppression of the Holy Roman Emperor. If the Reformation had only created Lutheranism, this one denomination, the Reform ideals could still be considered self-consistent. However, it's likely no one anticipated that this Lutheranism would give rise to an endless stream of new Protestant sects, sub-sects, further subdivisions, non-sect groups, house churches, and so on, in a myriad of forms and peculiarities. Seeing this outcome, it is believed that Reformation leaders like Martin Luther, if their spirits are in heaven, would be furious, especially when they see later generations placing all the blame on them. They would surely fly into a rage, even willing to crawl out of their graves to fight to the death with those who framed them. Epilogue. Even the madmen of World War II once lamented that once Pandora's box is opened, no one knows what demons and monsters will emerge. Indeed, the Reformation movement, by indulging a momentary impulse, opened Pandora's box. The result was both dramatic and tragic, a complete disappointment. The fact that schism occurred went against the original intentions of the movement's leaders. The emergence of schism was either created by the movement's opponents or reluctantly concocted by the movement leaders themselves. Chinese Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty, Li Shimin, had a sage and precious instruction. Using bronze as a mirror, one can adjust their attire. Using history as a mirror, one can understand the rise and fall of dynasties. Using people as a mirror, one can discern right and wrong. Applying this to the theme of this article, reflecting on the history of Christianity, from unity to division, and then from division towards unity. Then all the complex alliances and betrayals, the unpredictable twists and turns, ultimately define the Reformation movement, not only as a mirror, but as a super-demon revealing mirror. After all, extremes beget the opposite. After hardship comes prosperity. Believe that in the unseen realm, there is a divine will. Everything is within the Creator's control. Everything is implied, but not spoken. Today, the war of words can cease. Because no matter how eloquent the arguments, the eternal truth in the mortal realm is, what people say doesn't count. What heaven says is what counts.